part of the United Methodist Church, and we belong to the Susquehanna Conference, which pretty much takes up most of central PA from the north to the south. And our conference is broken up into 5 different districts, and then within each of those districts are what's known as clusters. And clusters are a group of clergy who serve churches that are in close proximity to each other. And as clergy, we meet on a pretty regular basis. So in my first appointment, I was part of one of the smallest clusters that I've ever been a part of. It was just the 3 churches that were in Chambersburg, where I was serving. And about 4 to 6 times a year, Kathy, Rick, and I would meet for breakfast at a local diner. And now, I was the youngest of the 3 of us by many years. Both Kathy and Rick are retired now. But I so appreciated their wisdom and guidance in my first years of ministry. They were a lot of encouragement to me. At the end of one of our particular meetings, though, in that very first year, when we each received our bill, I grabbed my purse, and I opened up my purse, and my heart immediately sank. The night before, I had been paying some bills, and my wallet that had all of my credit cards and all of my cash in it was still sitting on the side table in my living room, not there where I could pay for my meal. There was no way, absolutely no way that I could pay for my meal. And so I told Kathy and Rick the situation and how I felt so stupid. They were so gracious. They immediately started fighting over who was going to pay for my breakfast. But I was so embarrassed. I had forgotten something that you don't leave home without. I was really glad that I wasn't pulled over on the way to or from work that day. But there was no way for me at that moment to pay for my meal. I had to rely on the graciousness and help of another. Now, since that time, there have been countless times when I've been sick, or when I was pregnant, or when I was in those newborn stages of my boy's life, when I had to rely on others for life to continue on. And so I wonder, when have you had to rely on the graciousness of another person? We are now in the 2nd week of our series, Half-Truths. And this week, we are looking at this well-known phrase, God helps those who help themselves. Like the one we discussed last week and the ones that we'll continue to explore in the weeks ahead, we have no doubt heard this phrase by others and maybe even ourselves. And while many people think it is, it's not something that's in the Bible. And while it may be partly true, there are many ways that this phrase can be harmful and dangerous. But before I go on, I want to share something that I should have shared last week. This series already has gotten, may get, a little controversial. And I hope that you hear my heart when I say that my goal in this series, or in any of my preaching, is not to make you think like me. That's not my goal. My hope is that I can just make you think. And if you don't agree with me, that is okay. It's okay to disagree with me. I believe that we can still be the church together as we wrestle together with these difficult things. So let's first talk about how God helps those who help themselves has some truth to it. In each of our lives, we all know that we cannot just pray and trust that God will take care of everything while we sit idly by, right? My parents used to tell me about a group of students at their college who seemed to portray this deep faith in God and the ways that they acted with one another. But when it came to studying in college, they never quite got the point. They thought that if they prayed hard enough and trusted God hard enough, that He would give them the correct answers when they took an exam and that everything would be fine. This group soon discovered that life doesn't quite work that way, and they ended up flunking out in their very first semester. So much for that faith, right? Our prayers, I believe, are meant to move us into action. One of my professors in seminary used to pray before every class. He would say, God, help us to be the answers to the prayers that we make. And it's such a simple prayer, but it reveals that our prayer should move us into action as we trust God to lead us and to walk with us. There are situations in which all we can do is pray, but often Our prayers are meant to draw us closer to God, to heal us, and to empower us then to go out and serve as co-workers with God in answering our prayers. So there is truth to God helps those who help themselves. We are called to step up as God helps us. There's the truth in it. But is that the intention when somebody says, God helps those who help themselves? This is where our text from James comes in that you heard from Brian just a few moments ago. For James, our words carry more power than we often think they do. Throughout his letter, James tries to drive home the point that our devotion to God requires a particular kind of life and character. And he breaks it into 3 different parts that I want to kind of walk through together. So his first focus is on communication. We often say so many things without thinking them, right? That might be true for some of us more than others, that it can be hard to control what we say. For James, our words show our genuine faithfulness. We can't say hurtful words about our neighbors and think that that will be approved by God. James says that our anger does not produce God's righteousness, even when we think our anger is justified. Our words have power. So what's the intention behind God helps those who help themselves? Sometimes I wonder if it's used intentionally or unintentionally as a way of avoiding our call as Christians to love others, especially those who come from a different economical life than we do. It's easy for us to assume that those, for instance, those who stand on the street corner right in front of Harrisburg Hospital holding a sign asking for help are just living off of the system, right? It's easy to think, why doesn't that person just get a job? Or I'm sure if they spent their money differently, they could afford a place to live. But at the end of the day, everyone's story is different. There are people, I'm sure, who live off the system and perhaps take for granted the assistance that they rely on to survive. Life circumstances, though, certainly play a role in that kind of thinking and living. However, there are also many people who work hard as they struggle to make ends meet, and they can't bring themselves out of their situation without the assistance of other people. And many of them didn't choose the circumstances that brought them to that hardship. So many are just 1 or 2 paychecks away from losing everything. But whether people are living off the system or they're working hard to survive, is that really our job to figure out? Years ago at a conference, Bishop Ivan Abrams, who is from the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, said this: "How often don't I hear people say, if only people who were poor would pull themselves up by their bootstraps. How cruel is that? Because those people don't understand reality. Most of the poor don't have shoes." First, James talks about how Christians should communicate with one another, but then his second focus is encouraging his readers to not just be hearers of the word, but doers. He says that if we only hear the word, and he's talking about Scripture, if we only hear it and not do it, then we are like those who look at ourselves in a mirror and then go immediately forgetting what they look like. So reading and studying are important, but it doesn't mean anything if our life isn't being changed by it. So are we seeing things in the way that we wish to see them, or are we seeing things in the way that God sees them? I want to share with you a verse from our Old Testament, from Leviticus chapter 23, verse 22. "When you harvest your land's produce, you must not harvest all the way to the edge of your field. Leave these items for the poor and the immigrant. I am the Lord your God." So Leviticus is a book that a lot of people don't enjoy reading because it's filled with a whole bunch of laws that God had given to the Israelites as being a part of God's people. And some of them are kind of crazy, but it was all a way to set them apart so that others would know that they are God's people in that time. These laws, most of them, are God's intentions for humanity. So this law is a really big deal. Farmers today wouldn't typically leave part of their crops unharvested, right? But here, God told them to leave one part for the poor and the immigrant, meaning that there was charity and dignity then in the work. So those who saw the unharvested part and needed it could harvest it for themselves. In addition, God is showing that God is the ultimate source of any of our possessions. The fields were not theirs to begin with. God designed for part of it to be there for those who did not have the means to help themselves. In this plan, everyone has enough. And we see throughout the scriptures, time and time again, God desiring for everyone to have enough and for God's people to work so that all have enough. And then when we get to the last part of our reading, James explains how the kind of religion that God desires is the kind that cares for the orphans and the widows in their distress, a faith in which we are not following the ways of the world that seek to harm and destroy the other, but to follow in the ways of God. I think it's difficult for us to imagine that kind of world, a world where everyone has enough. It's difficult to imagine a world in which everyone cares for those who are in distress and on the margins. I think it's difficult to imagine because so many people are living in fear, and everyone has a different kind of fear. There's this show on ABC that I used to watch that just ended last season. Have any of you seen Station 19? Some of you. It was really good. I was really sad that it ended. But it's a show about a fire station in Seattle, and I'm always intrigued by the different calls that they take throughout the city and how they fight fire together. The only bad part about it was that it was on Thursday nights, and in which he was working on an ambulance. Those were the nights that he was away while I was watching Station 19, thinking about my husband riding around and getting into similar situations. But there was one episode years ago that told the story of two boys who decided to set off fireworks in a department store where fireworks were being sold. And as the firefighters were going into the store, as these fireworks are popping out, right, one of them went to the back of the store where the dressing rooms were located. And inside one of the rooms, he found this young man hiding under the bench, thinking that there was a shooting that was happening inside the store because fireworks going off sound a lot like gunshots. And he was literally crippled in fear, thinking that the shooter had found him when the curtain swung open by the firefighter. And it took that firefighter an extremely long time to get this man out of the store. He literally had to drag him until they were safe outside. And it reminded me just how much our society lives in fear. We fear mass shootings. We fear political leaders, we fear change, and we don't like to admit it, but we also fear people who don't look like us, or worship like us, or live like us, because we often associate them with a bad occurrence that we've heard or from others that we've experienced ourselves. We get that there are people who cannot help themselves, but it's so hard to know how we can help others when we are so fearful. This was many years ago, but I invite you to think back to the Syrian refugee crisis. It's been maybe 10 years ago now when this particular story happened. There was a speech that President Obama made at the Leaders Summit of Refugees in which he told the story of an American 6-year-old named Alex who saw a video of 5-year-old Imran Dakhnish in an ambulance in Aleppo after his home had been bombed. Some of you have seen that video or that picture. You might remember it. It was everywhere. But this American boy, Alex, wrote to Obama, and he said this: "Dear Mr. President, I want Omran to come and live with me and my family. Since we won't bring toys, I will share my bike and I will teach him how to ride it. I will teach him addition and subtraction. My little sister will be collecting butterflies and fireflies for him. We can play together. We will give him a family, and he will be our brother. That comes from the heart of a 6-year-old. And that 6-year-old understands how so many in our world cannot help themselves, and how God calls upon us to step in when someone else is suffering. Friends, I know that we can't solve all the problems of the world, and we might not know how to stop some of the injustices in our world and how we can help others who can't help themselves. But I hope that we can be like 6-year-old Alex and let go of our own fears to see others who are also living in fear the way that God sees them. Imagine if all of us could see someone who is genuinely hurting, who lives a life very different from our own, and to see them as a child of God and to say, I will be their family. They will be my brother. They will be my sister. I believe that there will come a time, if there hasn't come a time yet, in which you will find yourself in need. And it might be something small like forgetting your wallet, and I really hope that it's that. But it could be something much larger than you ever imagined. And whether it's your fault that you got into the mess or whether you had no control over it at all, the truth is that God helps those who cannot help themselves. And God continually stands by those that no one else is standing up for. God picks us up, wipes everyone clean, and declares that nothing can separate us from God's love. And when we are blessed beyond compare and in not need of help, God calls on us to be that messenger of love and that giver of hope. I pray that that would be so.